John checked his watch as he hurried to his car. His mother, Margaret, had been struggling with her memory for months now, and he knew she couldn't live alone anymore. He had hired a home nurse, Lisa, to take care of her, but something about leaving his mother with a stranger made him uneasy. He had done all the necessary background checks. Lisa was professional, polite, and had good experience in elderly care. Still, Margaret seemed nervous around her. Every time he mentioned Lisa's name, his mother's face would stiffen for a second before she forced a small smile. He assumed it was just her adjusting to change. After all, she had always been an independent woman, and now she needed help for even the smallest things. As he entered the house, Margaret was sitting in her old wooden chair by the window, staring outside. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood. She didn't turn when he walked in. He noticed how thin she had become, her hands resting weakly on her lap. She used to be so strong, always bustling around the kitchen or tending to her garden. Now she barely had the energy to leave her chair. He sighed and walked up to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mom, I need to go now. Lisa will take care of you," he said softly. Margaret finally turned her head to look at him. Her pale blue eyes were filled with something he couldn't quite understand. Was it fear? Sadness? She reached for his hand, her fingers cold against his skin. "Do you have to go?" she asked in a weak voice. John smiled reassuringly. "It's just for a few hours. I'll be back soon. You'll be fine." Margaret glanced at Lisa, who stood a few feet away, her usual gentle smile on her face. Lisa had always been calm and professional, but tonight, Margaret's grip on John's hand tightened. "Please, John, don't leave me alone," she whispered. John frowned. His mother had never been this anxious before. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Lisa is here to help you. You don't need to worry." Margaret's lips trembled as she struggled to say something, but then she shook her head and let go of his hand. "Never mind. Just go." John hesitated. Maybe he should cancel his meeting. Maybe he should stay. But Lisa stepped forward. "She'll be okay, Mr. Carter. I'll take good care of her," Lisa said softly. Margaret's eyes flickered toward Lisa, and for a brief second, something like fear flashed across her face. But then she looked away. John sighed. He was probably overthinking it. His mother's condition made her forgetful and sometimes confused. He bent down, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I love you, Mom. I'll see you soon." Margaret didn't respond. She only kept staring at the window as if she was watching something that no one else could see. John gave Lisa a small nod before walking out the door. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped outside. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in his chest. Everything was fine. Lisa was a professional. His mother was just being emotional. There was nothing to worry about. Inside the house, Margaret listened to the sound of the front door closing. The lock clicked. John was gone. She was alone with Lisa. Her heart started beating faster. She clutched the armrest of her chair, her fingers digging into the fabric. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. She glanced at Lisa, who was now walking toward the kitchen, humming softly. The sound made Margaret's skin crawl. "Would you like some tea, Mrs. Carter?" Lisa called out. Margaret didn't answer. Her throat was dry. Her mind raced. She knew this woman. She was sure of it. But from where? Why couldn't she remember? Lisa turned around, holding a cup of tea in her hands. Her smile was warm, her voice gentle. But Margaret's hands were shaking now. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She gripped the armrest tighter and whispered under her breath, "Who are you?" Lisa tilted her head slightly, her smile never fading. "I'm your nurse, Mrs. Carter. Don't worry. Everything is going to be just fine." Margaret's breath hitched. The way Lisa said those words, it wasn't comforting. It felt like a warning. "You said." Margaret's hands trembled as she stared at Lisa, who stood calmly in the kitchen, stirring the tea. The soft clinking of the spoon against the cup echoed in the quiet house. Something about the sound made Margaret's chest tighten. She didn't know why, but she felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in. Lisa walked over with a warm smile, placing the cup on the small table beside Margaret's chair. "Here you go, Mrs. Carter. A nice cup of tea will help you relax." Margaret didn't move. She simply stared at the tea, her fingers gripping the armrest. Her mind was a storm of confusion and fear. There was something about Lisa, something familiar yet deeply unsettling, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Lisa tilted her head slightly. "You seem a little tense. Are you feeling okay?" Margaret swallowed hard. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Who are you?" Lisa chuckled softly. "I already told you, Mrs. Carter. I'm your nurse." The words sent a chill down Margaret's spine. There was something in the way Lisa said it, too smooth, too rehearsed. Margaret's breath grew uneven. She wasn't just being paranoid. Something was wrong. Margaret's gaze flickered to the phone on the side table. Her fingers twitched. If she could just call John, he would understand. He would come back. She reached for the phone, but Lisa's hand was faster. She smoothly picked it up before Margaret could touch it. "Oh dear," Lisa said with a small smile. "I think you should rest instead of worrying." Margaret's body stiffened. She looked up at Lisa, her heart pounding. Lisa's face was still calm, still friendly, but her grip on the phone was firm. "I need to call my son," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. Lisa sat down across from her, placing the phone out of reach. "Mr. Carter is busy, isn't he? He said he would be back soon. You don't want to disturb him, do you?" Margaret felt her stomach drop. Lisa's tone was still gentle, but something about her words sent a wave of panic through her. She forced herself to take a deep breath. "Please, just give me the phone." Lisa sighed as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "Mrs. Carter, I'm here to take care of you. You're safe with me." Safe. That word felt wrong. The air in the room seemed to thicken, making it harder for Margaret to breathe. Her mind raced, trying to remember where she had seen Lisa before. There was a memory just out of reach, a shadow from the past that refused to come into focus. Margaret suddenly pushed herself up from the chair. She needed to get out of this room, out of this house. But the moment she tried to stand, dizziness took over. Her legs wobbled, and she nearly collapsed. Lisa was there in an instant, steadying her. "Careful, Mrs. Carter," she said softly. "You don't want to hurt yourself." Margaret felt trapped. Lisa's grip was firm, not rough, but strong enough to keep her in place. Panic surged through her veins. She had to get away. "Let me go," Margaret whispered. Lisa didn't move. She just held onto Margaret, her expression unreadable. The fear in Margaret's chest grew unbearable. She had no proof, no reason to be afraid. But deep in her heart, she knew one thing. She was not safe. John was in the middle of his meeting when his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen and saw his mother's name. His heart skipped a beat. Margaret rarely called him, especially in the evening. Something felt off. He let it ring for a few seconds before picking it up. "Mom," he said, keeping his voice low. There was silence on the other end. "Mom, are you there?" Then a faint, trembling whisper came through. "She's here. I know her. Don't leave me, John." John sat up straight. His mother's voice sounded weak and frightened. His grip on the phone tightened. "Mom, what are you talking about? Who's there?" Before she could answer, there was a loud crash in the background. Margaret gasped, and the call abruptly ended. John's stomach twisted. He immediately tried calling back, but the call went straight to voicemail. His pulse pounded in his ears. His mother had been fine just an hour ago. Why was she suddenly so scared? And what did she mean by "I know her"? Something was wrong. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his car keys and rushed out of the office. His colleagues called after him, but he didn't care. His mother needed him. As he sped down the road, his mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just her illness confusing her again. Maybe she had mistaken Lisa for someone else. But deep inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. He pressed his foot harder on the gas. He had to get to his mother. Fast. You said. Inside the house, Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her heart racing. The phone was gone. Lisa had taken it, placing it on the far side of the table where Margaret couldn't reach. The warm, friendly expression on Lisa's face hadn't changed, but something about her felt different now. Margaret swallowed hard. I know you, she whispered, her voice shaking. Lisa's smile faltered for just a second. Mrs. Carter, you're confused. Maybe you should lie down. Margaret shook her head, her hands gripping the armrest. No, I remember now. Her voice was stronger this time. She didn't remember everything, but flashes of an old memory flickered in her mind. A night from long ago. A younger face, similar to Liz's, filled with anger. A voice shouting in the dark. A terrible fight. And then, silence. Lisa took a slow step forward. You need to rest, Mrs. Carter. Thinking too much isn't good for you. Margaret's breath hitched. That phrase. Those exact words. Someone had said them to her before, years ago. And now Lisa was saying them again. The pieces were coming together, but the full picture was still just out of reach. Margaret's body tensed as Lisa moved even closer. Please, stay away from me, she pleaded. Lisa sighed. I'm only trying to help you. Margaret's eyes darted around the room. She had to get away, but her body was weak. Her hands trembled as she gripped the arms of her chair, trying to push herself up. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she managed to stand. Lisa stepped forward quickly. Careful, you might fall. Margaret backed away, her heart pounding. Don't touch me, she cried. Lisa stopped, raising her hands. All right, just sit back down. You're overthinking things. Margaret shook her head furiously. No, I know who you are. Lisa's expression darkened just for a moment. Her kind, patient face turned unreadable. And who do you think I am, Mrs. Carter? Margaret's breathing grew shallow. The memory was right there, waiting to be unlocked. But before she could speak, headlights flashed through the window. A car screeched to a stop outside. John was home. Margaret's legs gave out, and she collapsed back into her chair, gasping. Relief flooded through her. Her son was here. He would understand. He would protect her. Lisa turned toward the door as John's hurried footsteps echoed up the porch. Margaret took a shaky breath and whispered, She's lying, John. Don't trust her. Lisa didn't move, but for the first time, her smile completely disappeared. You said. John burst through the front door, his breath heavy, eyes scanning the room. The moment he saw his mother slumped in her chair, pale and trembling, his chest tightened. She looked terrified. Her frail hands clutched the armrest, as if holding on for dear life. Mom. He rushed toward her, kneeling beside her chair. What happened? Are you okay? Margaret's fingers weakly grabbed his sleeve. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She's lying. John, don't trust her. John's head snapped toward Lisa, who stood a few feet away, calm as ever. She tucked her hands neatly in front of her, her expression unreadable. Mr. Carter, Lisa said in a smooth voice, your mother had a small episode. She became confused and panicked. I was just trying to help her relax. John studied her carefully. His heart was still pounding from the call. His mother wasn't just confused, she was scared. And that wasn't normal. Margaret's grip tightened on his sleeve. John, she's not who she says she is. John turned back to his mother, his concern deepening. Mom, what do you mean? Margaret's trembling hands reached for something on the side table. It was an old, worn-out photo. She pressed it into John's palm. John looked down at it, his breath catching in his throat. The picture was old, faded at the edges, but he could clearly see a younger version of his father standing beside a woman who looked eerily similar to Lisa. His eyes slowly lifted back to Lisa. "Lisa," his voice was sharp now. "Who are you?" Lisa didn't blink. She didn't move. Then, after a long pause, she exhaled softly, tilting her head. "I think you already know, Mr. Carter." The room fell into silence. John's grip tightened around the photo. His mother's words from the call echoed in his mind. "She's here. I know her." He had no idea what was happening. But one thing was certain. Lisa wasn't just a nurse. And she wasn't here by accident. "You said." John's pulse pounded in his ears as he stared at Lisa. His mother's trembling breaths, the old photograph in his hand, and Lisa's eerily calm expression all pointed to one terrifying truth. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Margaret clung to his arm, her frail fingers digging into his sleeve. "John, she's not Lisa," she whispered. John's jaw tightened. He turned the photo over, scanning the back. Faint, faded handwriting read, "Michael Carter and Emily, 1978. His father's name, and the name of a woman he didn't recognize. He looked up, his chest tightening. "Who's Emily?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Lisa finally moved. A small, slow smile spread across her lips. "So, you've figured it out." John's stomach dropped. The way she said it, it wasn't surprise. It was satisfaction. Margaret's grip tightened. "She was your father's mistake," she whispered. John's mind reeled. His father had passed away years ago. He had never spoken about another woman. But Margaret's reaction, her terror, told him this wasn't some random affair. It was something much worse. Lisa, Emily, took a step closer. "Your father ruined my life," she said, her voice suddenly cold. "And your mother? She made sure I suffered for it." Margaret let out a shaky breath. "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely audible. "I thought you were gone." Lisa's eyes darkened. "You thought wrong." John's body tensed. Every instinct screamed at him to get his mother out of there. Lisa's hand reached into her pocket. John's breath hitched. Was she reaching for a weapon? Margaret gasped. John moved before he could think, grabbing a lamp from the table and throwing it between them. The crash sent Lisa stumbling back, giving him just enough time to pull Margaret to her feet. "Run," he shouted, supporting his mother as they bolted toward the door. But just as they reached the threshold, Lisa's voice rang out behind them. "You think you can escape me, John?" Something about the way she said his name sent ice through his veins. John didn't stop to look back. He needed to get his mother out of that house before it was too late. "You said." John half carried his mother down the front steps, his heart racing. The cold night air hit his face, but the fear burning inside him was worse. He could hear Lisa moving inside the house, her footsteps quick but controlled. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't afraid. She knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret clung to him, gasping. "She won't stop, John," she whispered. "She's been waiting for this." John pulled out his phone with one hand, his other arm wrapped tightly around his mother. He tried to dial 911, but his fingers trembled too much. The screen slipped, and the phone nearly fell. Behind them, the front door creaked open. John turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. Lisa stood in the doorway, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. She wasn't holding a weapon. She didn't need one. "Running won't change the past, John," she said softly. "And it won't change what's about to happen." John clenched his jaw, finally pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Lisa took a slow step forward. "You really think they'll get here in time?" John didn't answer. He grabbed his mother's hand and pulled her toward the car. The keys were in his pocket, but his hands were shaking too much to grab them fast enough. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "John." The way she said his name sent a chill down his spine. Lisa was still standing in the doorway, but she wasn't alone anymore. A dark figure moved behind her. A man. tall, broad shoulders, his face hidden in the shadows. John's blood ran cold. Margaret gripped his arm. She's not alone. John's fingers finally closed around the keys. He yanked open the car door and pushed his mother inside. Lock the doors, he ordered before slamming it shut. The phone was still in his other hand, the call still connected. A voice crackled through the speaker. 911. What's your emergency? John didn't have time to explain. He just turned and ran, straight toward Lisa and the stranger behind her. He wasn't going to let them take his mother. Not tonight. Not ever.